The flickering flames of the bonfire cast dancing shadows across the adobe walls of El Paso's plaza on the night of September 15, 1883. The air was thick with the smoke of mesquite wood and the intoxicating aroma of roasted chilies, but beneath the celebration lay a tension that would soon explode into violence. What happened that night would forever change how the Texas Rangers operated along the Mexican border, and it all began with one woman's desperate act of defiance. Subscribe now to uncover the untold story of Maria Gonzalez, the woman who single-handedly challenged the most feared law enforcement agency in the American Southwest. Maria Gonzalez stood barely 5 feet tall, her calloused hands evidence of years spent washing clothes for the wealthy Anglo families who had moved into El Paso after the railroad's arrival. At 34, she had already buried 2 husbands, one to typhoid, another to a mining accident in the Franklin Mountains. Her weathered face bore the lines of someone who had learned that survival meant fighting for every scrap of dignity in a world that saw Mexican women as invisible. The Fiesta de San Miguel had been El Paso's most important celebration for over a century, but by 1883, the traditional Mexican festivities had become a source of friction with the growing Anglo population. The newly arrived Texas Rangers, led by Captain Marcus Webb, viewed these gatherings as breeding grounds for what they called Mexican lawlessness. Webb's company had been stationed in El Paso for 6 months, ostensibly to maintain order, but locals knew their real purpose: to intimidate the Mexican-American population into submission. As the night deepened, the sound of guitars and accordions filled the narrow streets of the barrio. Children ran between the food stalls while their mothers sold tamales and pozole to anyone with a few coins. The men gathered around makeshift tables, playing Monte and discussing the rumors that had been circulating for weeks. Stories of rangers entering homes without warrants, confiscating property under the guise of searching for smuggled goods, and worse. Maria had heard these stories too, but tonight they felt distant. She was focused on her small pozole stand, trying to earn enough money to pay the rent on her tiny adobe house. The corn had been soaking for 3 days, ground by hand on her metate, and seasoned with red chilies she had dried herself. Each bowl represented hours of labor, and at 25 cents each, she needed to sell at least 20 to make the night worthwhile. The first sign of trouble came when Ranger Thomas Morrison approached her stand, his hand resting casually on his Colt .45. Morrison was known throughout the barrio as one of Webb's most aggressive men, a former Confederate soldier who made no secret of his contempt for what he called the Mexican problem. Maria served him without meeting his eyes, as experience had taught her that direct eye contact with rangers could be interpreted as defiance. Morrison examined the bowl suspiciously, stirring the hominy with his spoon as if searching for something hidden beneath the surface. To understand what drove Maria Gonzalez to her breaking point that September night, one must first understand the climate of terror that the Texas Rangers had created in El Paso throughout 1883. Captain Marcus Webb's company hadn't come to maintain peace. They had come to enforce what many saw as a campaign of ethnic cleansing disguised as law enforcement. Hit that notification bell, because what you're about to discover about the Rangers' true mission will shock you. The Rangers' arrival in El Paso coincided with the completion of the Southern Pacific Railroad, which had transformed the sleepy border town into a booming commercial hub. Suddenly, Anglo investors and settlers were pouring in, eager to capitalize on the cross-border trade and mining opportunities in the Franklin Mountains. But there was a problem. El Paso's population was over 70% Mexican-American, many of whom held land grants dating back to Spanish colonial times. Webb's Rangers quickly established a pattern of harassment designed to drive Mexican families from their homes. They would arrive at businesses and residences claiming to search for smuggled goods or wanted criminals. These searches invariably resulted in discovered contraband, usually planted by the Rangers themselves, leading to arrests, property confiscation, and deportation proceedings. Maria had first encountered this system 3 months earlier when Rangers burst into her neighbor Elena Morales' home at dawn. Elena, a widow with 4 children, was accused of hiding stolen cattle, an absurd charge since she owned no livestock and lived in a tiny 2-room adobe house. The Rangers found a silver bridle hidden beneath her kitchen floorboards, clearly planted evidence. Elena was arrested, her children sent to an Anglo orphanage, and her property seized by the county. The incident haunted Maria because she knew it could happen to anyone. The Rangers operated with complete impunity, protected by a legal system that automatically accepted their word over that of Mexican Americans. Federal officials in Austin either ignored complaints about Ranger misconduct or actively encouraged it as part of their broader strategy to civilize the border region. Webb himself was a veteran of the Indian Wars, having served under Colonel Ranald Mackenzie during the brutal campaigns against the Comanche. He brought the same ruthless efficiency to his war against El Paso's Mexican population, viewing them not as American citizens but as foreign occupiers to be removed by any means necessary. The Rangers' tactics were sophisticated in their cruelty. They would target community leaders first: merchants, teachers, local officials, anyone who might organize resistance. They understood that terror was most effective when applied systematically, creating an atmosphere where every Mexican family lived in constant fear of the midnight knock on the door. Maria's own family had not been spared. Her brother Diego, who worked as a translator for the customs office, had been arrested on fabricated smuggling charges just 2 weeks before the fiesta. The Rangers claimed to have found gold coins sewn into his jacket, coins that Maria knew had been planted. Diego was currently sitting in the El Paso jail, awaiting a trial that everyone knew would end in conviction and deportation. The psychological impact of this campaign extended far beyond its immediate victims. Mexican-American families began selling their properties at far below market value, fleeing to Mexico or deeper into the American interior. Those who remained lived in a state of constant vigilance, afraid to speak Spanish in public, afraid to gather in groups, afraid to practice their traditions. Yet the Fiesta de San Miguel represented something that even the Rangers couldn't easily suppress, a celebration so deeply rooted in the community's identity that abandoning it would mean surrendering their very souls. For Maria, attending the fiesta wasn't just about selling pozole. It was an act of cultural resistance, a declaration that she and her people belonged in the land their families had inhabited for generations. As the fiesta reached its peak around 10 o'clock that September evening, Captain Webb made a decision that would prove catastrophic. He ordered his 7 Rangers to conduct what he called a routine patrol through the celebration, a deliberate provocation designed to demonstrate Anglo authority during the Mexican community's most sacred gathering. The Rangers entered the plaza in formation, their spurs jingling against the cobblestones as they pushed through crowds of celebrating families. Webb rode at the front on a black stallion, his silver badge catching the firelight as he surveyed the scene with unconcealed contempt. Behind him, Morrison and the others followed on foot, their hands never straying far from their weapons. This is where our story takes a dark turn. Make sure you're subscribed because what happens next reveals the true nature of frontier justice. The Rangers' presence immediately dampened the festive atmosphere. Musicians stopped playing, dancers cleared the center of the plaza, and parents pulled their children closer. The carefully orchestrated celebration that had taken weeks to organize was being systematically destroyed by 7 men who viewed Mexican culture as inherently threatening to American order. Webb's strategy was psychological warfare at its most refined. Rather than making immediate arrests or starting a confrontation, he ordered his men to conduct inspections of the food vendors and musicians. They would approach each stall, examine the merchandise with exaggerated suspicion, and question the vendors about permits and licenses that didn't exist in 1883 El Paso. Maria watched from behind her pozole pot as Ranger Morrison approached the tortilla stand operated by her friend Carmen Vasquez. Carmen, 63 years old and a fixture at every community celebration for decades, trembled as Morrison picked through her carefully arranged stacks of fresh tortillas. He selected one, took a bite, chewed slowly, then spat it onto the ground. Morrison's voice carried across the suddenly quiet plaza as he declared the food unfit for consumption by civilized people. He kicked over Carmen's clay comal, scattering hot tortillas across the dusty ground and destroying hours of preparation. Carmen fell to her knees, frantically trying to salvage what she could, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The scene was repeated at vendor after vendor. Rangers poured precious milk onto the ground, claiming it was sour. They scattered hand-ground masa, alleging it contained foreign objects. They confiscated bottles of tejuino, the traditional fermented corn drink, claiming it was illegally distilled alcohol. Each act of destruction was accompanied by lectures about American standards and proper sanitation. But Webb's masterstroke came when Ranger Jake Coleman approached the group of musicians who had been providing entertainment throughout the evening. These weren't professional performers, but local men who worked construction and mining jobs during the week and shared their musical talents during celebrations. Their instruments, guitars, mandolins, and a single violin, represented months of savings from wages that barely covered survival. Coleman examined the violin with theatrical interest, turning it over in his hands as if it were evidence in a criminal case. He plucked the strings experimentally, producing discordant notes that echoed across the now silent plaza. Then, claiming the instrument was suspiciously valuable and might be stolen property, he smashed it against the stone fountain in the center of the plaza. The sound of splintering would seem to break something fundamental in the crowd's collective spirit. These weren't just objects being destroyed, they were the tools through which a community expressed its deepest cultural identity. The violin had belonged to old Manuel Herrera, who had played at every wedding, baptism, and celebration in El Paso for 30 years. Its destruction wasn't law enforcement, it was cultural annihilation. Maria felt something change inside her chest as she watched Manuel fall to his knees beside the broken pieces of his instrument. The old man's hands shook as he gathered fragments of wood and twisted metal strings, as if he could somehow repair what had been deliberately destroyed. Other vendors began backing away from their stalls, gathering their families and preparing to flee. Webb sat on his horse, surveying the devastation with evident satisfaction. This was exactly what he had intended, to demonstrate that Mexican culture existed in El Paso only at the pleasure of Anglo authority, and that pleasure could be withdrawn at any moment. The message was clear: abandon your traditions, abandon your language, abandon your identity, or face the consequences. But Webb had miscalculated. In his arrogance, he had assumed that systematic humiliation would breed submission. Instead, he had created the conditions for something far more dangerous: a person with nothing left to lose. What happened next would be debated in newspapers from San Antonio to Washington, D.C., but everyone agreed on one crucial detail. Maria Gonzalez's transformation from victim to avenger began with a single, devastating personal attack. Ranger Morrison, emboldened by the evening's successful intimidation campaign, approached Maria's pozole stand with a swagger that suggested he had saved the best for last. Maria had been watching the systematic destruction of her neighbors' livelihoods with growing fury, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had a daughter to think about, 15-year-old Anna, who worked as a seamstress for an Anglo family and was trying to save money for teachers' training. Morrison lifted the lid of Maria's large clay pot and peered inside, stirring the carefully prepared pozole with a dirty finger. The hominy had been cooking since dawn, the pork shoulder falling apart after hours of slow simmering, the red chili sauce perfectly balanced between heat and flavor. It represented not just Maria's livelihood but her grandmother's recipe, passed down through 4 generations of women who had survived everything from Apache raids to the Mexican-American War. What Morrison did next crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Stay tuned to discover how one man's cruelty ignited a firestorm that would consume 7 rangers. Morrison declared the pozole contaminated and began overturning the pot. As gallons of carefully prepared food poured onto the ground, Maria's life savings literally disappeared into the dust. But Morrison wasn't finished. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a handful of coins, clearly planted evidence, which he dropped into the emptying pot. Morrison's voice rang out across the plaza as he announced that Maria Gonzalez was under arrest for accepting payment in Mexican pesos, technically illegal under recent anti-smuggling ordinances, though the law was rarely enforced except when rangers needed a pretext for arrests. The charge carried a mandatory sentence of 6 months in county jail and automatic deportation proceedings. As Morrison reached for the handcuffs attached to his belt, something inside Maria snapped. This wasn't just about her pozole or even her impending arrest. This was about her brother Diego rotting in jail on false charges. This was about her neighbor Elena's children torn from their mother's arms. This was about old Manuel's violin smashed for the crime of bringing joy to his community. Maria's hand closed around the metal ladle she had been using to serve her pozole. The ladle was large and heavy, designed for stirring substantial quantities of food in large pots. As Morrison bent forward to secure the handcuffs around her wrists, Maria swung the ladle with all the strength that 34 years of hard labor had built into her compact frame. The blow caught Morrison directly across the temple with a wet, sickening crack that could be heard throughout the suddenly silent plaza. Morrison dropped instantly, blood pouring from a gash that extended from his forehead to his ear. The handcuffs clattered to the ground beside his motionless body. For a moment, the entire plaza seemed frozen. Rangers, vendors, families with children. Everyone stared in shock at the sight of a tiny Mexican woman standing over a fallen Texas Ranger, her blood-covered ladle still clutched in her trembling hand. Maria herself seemed stunned by what she had done, staring down at Morrison's unconscious form as if she couldn't quite believe her own actions. Captain Webb's voice shattered the silence as he roared orders to his remaining 6 Rangers. Guns were drawn, horses wheeled around, and the systematic intimidation campaign that had been unfolding all evening suddenly erupted into open warfare. But Webb had made a crucial tactical error. He had allowed his men to spread out across the plaza during their inspections, leaving them scattered and vulnerable when violence finally erupted. Maria looked up from Morrison's motionless body to see 6 Rangers converging on her position from different directions, their weapons drawn and their faces twisted with rage. She understood immediately that she was going to die in the next few minutes. There was no scenario in which a Mexican woman who had attacked a Texas Ranger would survive the night. But as she prepared to meet her fate, Maria noticed something that would prove crucial to everything that followed. The Rangers' aggressive patrol through the Fiesta had brought them dangerously close to the bonfire that had been built in the center of the plaza. A massive structure of mesquite logs, dried corn stalks, and paper decorations that had been burning for hours and was now a towering inferno reaching nearly 15 feet into the night sky. Maria's eyes moved from the approaching Rangers to the bonfire, then to the various containers of cooking oil, alcohol, and other flammable materials that the vendors had brought for food preparation. A desperate plan began forming in her mind. A plan so audacious and dangerous that it could only have been conceived by someone who had already accepted death as inevitable. What Maria Gonzalez accomplished in the next 90 seconds would be studied by military tacticians and law enforcement agencies for decades to come. Using nothing but her intimate knowledge of the plaza's layout and the Rangers' own aggressive positioning against them, she turned a certain death sentence into the most devastating defeat in Texas Ranger history. The plaza where the fiesta was held had been designed in the traditional Spanish colonial style, with vendor stalls arranged in a rough circle around a central fountain and bonfire. The Rangers, in their arrogance, had positioned themselves to block all the obvious escape routes, the 4 streets that led away from the plaza. But Maria wasn't thinking about escape. She was thinking about revenge. What happens next defied every expectation of how frontier violence was supposed to unfold. Hit subscribe to witness the impossible. As the 6 Rangers closed in on her position, Maria began moving not away from them but toward the massive bonfire in the center of the plaza. Her movement seemed erratic, even panicked, causing the Rangers to adjust their approach in ways that would prove fatal. Captain Webb, still mounted on his black stallion, shouted orders for his men to take her alive. He wanted Maria to stand trial as an example to the Mexican community. But Maria's seemingly random movements were actually precise calculations. She had spent countless hours in this plaza over the years, selling food at celebrations, attending masses at the small chapel on the eastern side, watching her daughter play with other children around the fountain. She knew every uneven stone, every slight elevation change, every architectural feature that could be used to tactical advantage. The Rangers' first mistake was underestimating their opponent. They saw a terrified Mexican woman running blindly toward a fire, not a strategist with nothing to lose. Their second mistake was maintaining their scattered formation instead of consolidating their positions. Their third mistake was following her toward the bonfire without considering why she might be leading them there. What Maria Gonzalez accomplished in the next 90 seconds would be studied by military tacticians and law enforcement agencies for decades to come. Using nothing but her intimate knowledge of the plaza's layout and the Rangers' own aggressive positioning against them, she turned a certain death sentence into the most devastating defeat in Texas Ranger history. The plaza where the Fiesta was held had been designed in the traditional Spanish colonial style, with vendor stalls arranged in a rough circle around a central fountain and bonfire. The Rangers, in their arrogance, had positioned themselves to block all the obvious escape routes, the 4 streets that led away from the plaza. But Maria wasn't thinking about escape. She was thinking about revenge. What happens next defied every expectation of how frontier violence was supposed to unfold. Hit subscribe to witness the impossible. As the 6 Rangers closed in on her position, Maria began moving not away from them but toward the massive bonfire in the center of the plaza. Her movement seemed erratic, even panicked, causing the Rangers to adjust their approach in ways that would prove fatal. Captain Webb, still mounted on his black stallion, shouted orders for his men to take her alive. He wanted Maria to stand trial as an example to the Mexican community. But Maria's seemingly random movements were actually precise calculations. She had spent countless hours in this plaza over the years, selling food at celebrations, attending masses at the small chapel on the eastern side, watching her daughter play with other children around the fountain. She knew every uneven stone, every slight elevation change, every architectural feature that could be used to tactical advantage. As Maria circled the bonfire, she grabbed flammable items from abandoned vendor stalls, cooking oil, alcohol, anything that could be weaponized. Ranger Jake Coleman raised his weapon for a shot, but Maria threw a clay pot of cooking oil directly at his face. The vessel shattered on impact, drenching Coleman in flammable liquid just 15 feet from the massive bonfire. Using a burning brand from the fire, Maria ignited Coleman's oil-soaked clothing. The Ranger exploded into flames with a horrifying whoosh, his screams filling the night as he ran blindly through the plaza, spreading fire to everything he touched. Within seconds, the vendor stalls erupted into flames 20 feet high, turning the celebration into a blazing inferno. The transformation of El Paso's plaza into a death trap happened with terrifying speed. Coleman's burning body ignited everything in his path: wooden tables soaked in spilled alcohol, paper decorations, and containers of cooking oil that exploded like bombs throughout the area. The next moments would claim 5 more Rangers in ways no one could have predicted. Stay subscribed to witness history's most shocking revenge. Captain Webb found himself trapped as the bonfire became the center of a spreading inferno. His Rangers, trained for combat against human opponents, had no experience fighting both an enemy and fire simultaneously. The thick smoke provided Maria perfect concealment while the Rangers stumbled blindly through unfamiliar, burning terrain. Ranger Hutchins tried to help the burning Coleman but had his own clothes ignited when Coleman grabbed onto him in desperation. Now 2 Rangers were on fire, their screams adding to the chaos. Rangers Bradley, Wilson, O'Brien, and Stevens found themselves separated by walls of flame, unable to coordinate any response. Maria's next target was Bradley, positioned behind the stone fountain. She thrust a burning brand into oil-soaked decorations around the fountain, creating an explosion that instantly ignited Bradley's clothing. In panic, he threw himself into the fountain, only to discover the water's surface was covered with a thin layer of oil from spilled vendor supplies. The fountain became a death trap of burning water. Bradley's screams echoed as he thrashed helplessly in flames that followed him wherever he moved. The remaining Rangers, Wilson, O'Brien, and Stevens, made a desperate attempt to reach Captain Webb's position and organize a retreat. But Maria anticipated this move. Using wind patterns, she set fire to corn husks upwind of Webb's position. When flames reached containers of mezcal, the explosion created a deadly shower of flaming liquid and ceramic shrapnel that rained down on Webb's location, forcing his horse to throw him to the ground. Rangers Wilson and O'Brien, trying to reach their captain, ran directly into Maria's final trap. She had overturned her pozole pot near the western exit, creating a slippery mess invisible in the smoke. Both Rangers lost their footing and fell into burning debris, their struggles only entangling them further in flaming wood and fabric. Stevens, the last mobile ranger, abandoned his comrades and fled toward what he thought was a clear exit. But Maria had prepared for this moment. Every escape route had been transformed into a death trap. A carefully rigged pot of cooking oil fell directly onto Stevens' head as he ran through the northern archway, drenching him in oil just as burning debris began falling like rain. What Maria witnessed in those final moments would haunt her for the rest of her life. Make sure you're subscribed to see how this changed everything. Captain Webb, his uniform smoldering and authority shattered, made one last desperate attempt to kill Maria. Crawling through smoke with his service revolver, he managed to get within 10 feet of her position. But his gun hand had been severely burned by flaming alcohol, making it impossible to grip his weapon steady. Maria watched Webb struggle to cock his revolver with fingers that no longer responded properly. She could have easily finished him, but instead spoke in perfect English. "You came to destroy our celebration. You wanted to show us our traditions existed subject to your approval. Now you know what it feels like to have everything you value turned to ash." Webb's response was lost in coughing, but his eyes showed something Maria had never seen before: recognition that he was facing an equal. For the first time since Rangers arrived in El Paso, an Anglo lawman was looking at a Mexican woman and seeing someone capable of determining his fate. The other Rangers were beyond help now. Coleman, Hutchins, and Bradley had succumbed to their burns. Wilson and O'Brien remained trapped beneath collapsed stalls, their struggles growing weaker. Stevens had transformed into a human torch, illuminating the street as he collapsed in the dust. Webb turned his damaged weapon on himself, but his burned fingers couldn't manipulate the trigger properly. His final act became pathetic fumbling with a gun that refused to cooperate. Maria turned away. She had seen enough death, and her own survival was far from guaranteed as flames spread beyond the plaza. The sun rose on September 16, 1883, Mexican Independence Day, to reveal a scene that would reshape the balance of power along the entire Texas-Mexico border. Where El Paso's plaza had once stood, only smoldering ruins and 7 charred bodies remained, but Maria Gonzalez's impossible victory had already begun spreading through Mexican-American communities from California to Louisiana. What happened to Maria after that night remained a mystery for decades. Hit subscribe to discover how her legend grew beyond anything she could have imagined. News of the El Paso massacre reached Austin within 3 days. Governor John Ireland ordered 2 additional ranger companies to find Maria Gonzalez dead or alive. But something fundamental had changed. Where once there had been fear and submission, there was now defiant resistance. Mexican-American witnesses who had previously cooperated out of fear now refused to answer questions. The San Antonio Express ran investigative articles about ranger misconduct, using the massacre as evidence that aggressive tactics created more problems than they solved. Federal investigators discovered a systematic campaign of harassment, illegal searches, and deportation proceedings that violated multiple federal laws. Most significantly, corridos, traditional ballads, began appearing throughout the Southwest, telling the story of the woman who had burned 7 Rangers with courage and cleverness. These songs transformed Maria from a desperate woman into a symbol of resistance against oppression, with different versions emerging in different communities. The Texas Rangers were forced to completely restructure their border operations. The old system of unaccountable companies with unlimited authority was replaced by centralized command and federal oversight. Rangers now required written justification for actions and could no longer make arrests based solely on their testimony. As for Maria herself, she vanished completely. Some claimed she fled to Mexico, others that she traveled north to become a teacher where her past was unknown. Most likely, she had prepared for disappearing long before the Fiesta, maintaining connections on both sides of the Rio Grande with access to support networks. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the truth about what happened to Maria would finally be revealed in 1943, 60 years after the night that changed everything. The plaza where the massacre occurred was never rebuilt. Today it remains an empty lot in downtown El Paso, marked only by a small plaque mentioning the civil disturbance of 1883. But every September 15th, Mexican-American families gather there to remember the night when one woman's courage changed history. Maria Gonzalez proved that even in hopeless circumstances, resistance is possible. Her legacy lives on in the corridos that still sing her story and in every person who refuses to accept injustice as inevitable. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against oppression isn't a gun or law, it's the decision to fight back, no matter the cost.